Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, because it looks that way here. Well, that's good.
No, none of the students are there.
I'm sorry?
None of the students are there. I'm going to send them an email telling them I'm going to redo the class and, oops, that's not what
Yeah, now we'd give them, you know, they're all gonna have their schedule things, but I would
Yeah.
say, you know, you'd be able to plug into it at some point.
Yeah.
You're not gonna pop up for somebody you might,
Well, I'll stay. I mean, I'm still, the Zoom thing is open, so.
yeah. I would definitely stay there.
So when we left off last time, the colonists and the British had a standoff at Bunker Hill. And at the end of the day, the British held the hill, but the colonists now felt emboldened because they had been able to fight off 3 British assaults and only gave up when they were out of ammunition. And also George Washington was on his way to Cambridge to take command of the Continental Army. Now, Washington arrived in early July of 1775, and he was really struck by the New Englanders. They weren't at all what he was expecting. Remember, Washington is a Virginian. He's a Virginia planter. He owns slaves, and he is also a general, and he knows that generals are supposed to command. But he found the New Englanders didn't take orders. That is, they were used to electing their officers, choosing who would lead them, and also didn't really respond to direct orders. They always wanted to know why they had to do something. This is the way they were used to operating, being very autonomous. And he got the sense that they weren't going to be very good soldiers. In fact, you can read in his letters about how frustrated he is with these people he found here for a lot of different reasons. And it was this attitude that the New Englanders had that each of them was just as good as the next one. And that if they didn't like their officers, then they would simply not choose different officers when they had the opportunity. And also, they didn't want to have to do the mundane things that are really essential in a military operation. The camp was completely filthy. This really struck Washington, the fact that they weren't observing any kind of sanitary conditions in these camps. And these camps are spread roughly from here, Prospect Hill in Somerville, through Cambridge and into Roxbury, and they're filthy. There are soldiers camped or in and around Harvard Yard, Harvard Square. There's a group from Gloucester, a group of Gloucester fishermen camped out in the Brattle House, and Washington wants to make that his headquarters. It would be a good headquarters for him. And it takes about 2 weeks to clean this house. It's on Brattle Street in Cambridge. The house still stands. It's a National Historical Landmark. It took 2 weeks to clean it because of the filth in the house. And as I said, the soldiers aren't digging latrines, so the place is filthy. And he's really struck by how dirty these people are. Each one thinks he's as good as everyone else. They're filthy, don't listen to orders. And he said they're never conscious of danger until there's a bayonet pointed in their breast. He can't even find out how many men there are under his command. The first thing he wants to know is how many men are there? Can't find out. Every day there's a different reason why we couldn't count them. Well, these men are gone, but we think they're coming back. It takes weeks before he finds out a rough estimate. And he didn't know, does he have 10,000 men? Does he have 20,000 men? It's really unclear to Washington. And he is getting to know these people, not really coming to like them. And all through the summer of 1775, there are episodes that Washington finds more and more frustrating. If he is going to command this army and bring it to lead it to whatever the end game is, he is going to need to get some control over these soldiers. They're always fighting with each other. And also they like to fire off their guns. One of the first things he has to do is get the men who have hovered around the camp selling liquor to leave. Because you have these 10, 20,000 men, all of them armed, all of them expecting that they knowing they're doing a great favor to everyone by serving. And they're getting drunk and having a good time, firing off their guns as kind of a sport. There is one story about Washington riding into Harvard Square, and he was always accompanied by William Lee, who was a slave to Washington. And Lee accompanies Washington throughout the war. They're riding in, and there is a brawl going on between these soldiers. And apparently the brawl started because a group of Virginia soldiers had come up, Virginia riflemen, and they didn't like the fact that a lot of these New England militia units had African Americans in them. That is, the town militia would have included African Americans. And Washington did try to segregate the troops. He wanted to discourage African American enlistments. In fact, he gives an order to do that. By the end of the year, he reverses it, knowing they need all of the men they can get. But here he comes upon this brawl. And according to the story, this gives us some sense of Washington's ability to take command of a situation. He jumped off of his horse, threw the reins to William Lee, and he marched through this mob into the center of it. And he picked up the two ringleaders, these two guys who were in the middle of it, going at it, fighting each other, picks them up, it said, by their collars, held them up, and then it said he spoke to them. You can imagine what he said. And this does, of course, calm things down, but Washington is constantly finding this kind of evidence that these men are not going to be the kind of fighting force he was expecting. And middle of the summer, as mentioned, he thought these guys are filthy. They don't know how to dig latrines. They don't take care of themselves. They, with no latrines, their men are relieving themselves wherever they want to. And you can imagine how disgusting this is, and also unhealthy. And in the middle of August, a group of ladies from the area had come to see Washington. Abigail Adams comes to see Washington, coming up from Quincy. And she writes to her husband that you didn't tell me half of what to expect from Washington, that Washington is an impressive person. But as they're crossing this little footbridge over the Charles River, here are the soldiers bathing in the river. That is, they're diving into the Charles River and then swimming around and climbing back onto the bridge and diving off again. It's the middle of the day, and they're all stark naked. And these women report this to Washington when they get to his headquarters. He's absolutely shocked. The general orders the next day, and you can find the Washington's general orders under the Washington papers if you're still looking for a primary source. He says, I don't want to discourage you from the practice of bathing, but you should have more sense than to do this in the middle of the day when some of the finest ladies in the neighborhood are crossing the bridge. And he also, as I said, he can't find out how many soldiers he has under his command. And there's one episode where he is given the report. When he arrived in the camp, he was told that they have 300 barrels of gunpowder, which is, gunpowder has to be manufactured. Most of it's imported. And in fact, one thing Washington and the Continentals are able to do is capture a couple of vessels carrying British weaponry, but you need a steady supply of gunpowder. One of the reasons they had to give up at Bunker Hill was because they were running out of gunpowder. So he's told, we have 300 barrels of gunpowder. And someone says, well, when we gave you that report, this is a few weeks later, we had forgotten to subtract what we used at Bunker Hill. We have 30 barrels of gunpowder. That's enough for each man to fire about 6 to 8 rounds. And at that moment, I imagine Washington could hear in the distance some of the soldiers firing off their guns. And he is just, this is the moment when Washington tells everyone to leave the room except for Joseph Reed, his secretary. Then he closes the door. And then for the next half hour, Reed reports, Washington swore. Washington had a very bad temper, and one of the real achievements in his life was mastering it. We have very few episodes where Washington loses his temper, and they're memorable for those who were there, and this is one of them. And he was swearing about the fact that he had gotten himself into this impossible situation. So as Washington is finding it difficult to get along with these New England soldiers and thinking, boy, they were really misrepresented to him by John Adams and the others who encouraged him to take this position. He does find a couple of officers who impress him. And they are, when he is making his inspection tour, this is a day or two after arriving, he went to Roxbury, and at the highlands of Roxbury, he found, he and Charles Lee had been a general in the British Army, and he was living in America. He was on a pension from the British Army. And then he resigned his pension to become second in command to the American Army. This is kind of an interesting detail. It took about 2 weeks for Congress and Lee to reach a proper settlement on how much Lee would be paid, because Lee was giving up his pension in the British Army. Washington did not want to be paid. He only wanted Congress to cover his expenses. But Lee is the second in command, and he is, according to the British, a real general, because he had a commission in the British Army, whereas Washington is just commissioned by Congress. And what power does Congress have to commission generals? But Lee is getting paid, and Lee and Washington make this inspection tour from Washington's headquarters in Cambridge. They're inspecting the lines, and they get to Roxbury. And there, Washington and Lee meet Henry Knox. And Knox would have been walking, because Knox weighed well over 200 pounds. Very rarely would anyone offer a horse to Henry Knox, because it would have killed the animal to have a man of that girth on the horse. Knox was only about 24 years old. He had been in an artillery unit before the war. In fact, he ran a bookstore in Boston. And his bookstore was, he liked books about military strategy. And his bookstore became a hangout for militia officers who were interested in military science, as well as some British officers before the occupation of Boston begins in earnest. And so Knox knew a lot of people who also were interested in military science, as it was called. And when Knox, I don't think it was his 21st or 22nd birthday, he was hunting out on the Boston Harbor. He was in a rowboat, and the gun misfired and blew off a few fingers on his right hand. And he bandaged his hand up and then rowed back and had Dr. Joseph Warren attend to it. So Knox had been in this artillery unit. He no longer was. In fact, he didn't have a military position at all. But as the Troubles began, Knox oversaw the construction of a fort in Roxbury on what is still called Fort Hill in Roxbury. And there, Henry Knox oversaw the building of a fort. And building a fort is something that does require a certain understanding of military science, the proper angles, how you'll mount the guns if you have guns. And this fort, roughly here, something just happened that I didn't want to happen. Um, the fort roughly here is what keeps the British from coming out of Boston this way. That is, they're able to command the heights overlooking Boston Neck from this fort in Roxbury. So this Knox impresses Washington. The other person who impresses Washington is Nathaniel Greene. Greene is an officer from Rhode Island. Greene had been a Quaker. In fact, he grew up, his father was an ironmonger. They had forges, which is what gave Nathaniel Greene, as a young man, not getting an education because his father thought that an education would only waste him when what he's going to be doing is molding iron into anchors and things. Why do you need to study books for that? He does give him a limp. And early on in the 1770s, Greene helps to form a regiment in Rhode Island. He pays to outfit the regiment. And then he hears grumbling among some of the men that when they're marching in a parade, they really don't like having their commanding officer limping. So rather than embarrass these men, he's just outfitted. Greene resigns from this military unit. And then when the trouble happens at Lexington and Concord, Rhode Island is going to send units up, and they can't find an officer who wants to command them because the officers think it's going to be too risky. Yeah, and so the higher ups in the Rhode Island military order don't want to take on this responsibility. So Greene does. Greene does go up to leads the Rhode Island troops who are camped in Roxbury. And it's on the same day that Washington meets Henry Knox that he also meets Nathaniel Greene. And what Washington is impressed with in Greene's camp is how clean it is. It's immaculate. And these latrines, very well dug. And Washington, after seeing the filth in Cambridge, seeing how well managed Greene's camp was, is something that really strikes Washington as impressive. So two things happen almost immediately. One is Nathaniel Greene and the Rhode Island unit are transferred from Roxbury to Cambridge, actually to Prospect Hill, where they will now be on the front lines. And Henry Knox is given an assignment. It's kind of a good news, bad news proposition for Henry Knox. Seeing his command of military science, Washington is going to put Knox in charge of all the artillery in the Continental Army. The bad news is the artillery, we don't really have any artillery. Knox is going to have to go get it, and Knox does. Back in May, Ethan Allen, who was the leader of a group of folks in Bennington, Vermont. Actually, Bennington was claimed by both New Hampshire and New York. It's not yet Vermont. Long dispute between these two over this area called the New Hampshire Grants, Grants. And Allen and his group had come up from Connecticut to get this cheap land in the New Hampshire grants. It was also claimed by New York. And the Crown had sided with New York in awarding the land to New York instead of to New Hampshire, and certainly not making it independent. I should say that Massachusetts also had a claim on this territory as well. Now, Allen and others in that part of the area had been fighting against New York. And now Allen sees a real potential prize for them at Fort Ticonderoga. which is on Lake Champlain, right about here. Bennington is here. And here's the thing, as in many of these British forts in North America, there was a very small garrison. And then they would rely on local militia in case there were any trouble. And this fort had been built to protect the New England colonies and New York from an invasion from the French coming down Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain, a tremendous avenue into these American colonies. And so the British had built this fort. Actually, the French built it first when they controlled the area. Then the British took it over, and then the French took it over, and the British took it again. But now you'll recall the British had pretty much kicked the French out in 1761. So you have this very small garrison in this aging, poorly maintained fort that does have within it about 80 to 100 pieces of heavy artillery. And Allen knows it is there. So Allen is going to set about to get it. Meanwhile, a militia officer from Connecticut named Benedict Arnold also knows that artillery is up there. And Arnold thinks it would be of more service to the Continental Army than it would be to Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen's main purpose in getting this artillery was not to support the Continental Army, but it was to use it against New York, keeping New York out of the New Hampshire grants. So Arnold goes up to keep an eye on things, and he arrives just as Allen and his group are preparing to attack the fort, and he announces that he is in charge. He comes in a very fancy uniform, and he's allowed to accompany Allen and the others, and it's, I guess, fortunate for the American cause that he does. And the story is that they do, this is Fort Ticonderoga, which actually has been restored and well worth visiting. I'm told not to encourage people to visit public places, but go back in the spring when it's safe. And they wake up the commander, and he wants to, he's, basically, you have all these armed men. They outnumber the small garrison there. They've taken the sentry. They've taken other men prisoner. And he's told, surrender the fort. And he says, well, to whom am I surrendering it? This is Allen. And Allen says, according to the legend, it's one of these great lines which someone might actually have said, you're surrendering to the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. I guess the great Jehovah was the one that Allen and his force were under, and Benedict Arnold was coming to representing the Continental Congress. All this artillery now has fallen into the hands of the Americans. This is General Arnold, and now Knox is going to be dispatched to get it. Here we are waking up the commander. Fanciful drawing of that particular scene. So Knox is going to go get this. Now, it is still really unclear what it is these men are fighting about. It's also unclear to the British forces now besieged in Boston what they're trying to do. You remember, they had come to put down a rebellion and make sure that these people remain loyal to the crown. And the thinking in Britain is, what you have here is really a group of hotheads in Boston who've kind of whipped up this enthusiasm, prevented people from going about their daily business, and most people don't want to be part of a rebellion against the empire. The rest of the colonies, the British Crown knows, want to remain loyal to us. And that might have been true. So one thing that the British forces want to do, well, they know they need to, actually, if we just look at this militarily, Boston is not a good place from which to win back the loyalty of the rest of the colonies. Because as I've said, we know Bostonians tend to be rebellious and so on. And most of the people in the rest of the colonies think that they're a bunch of religious crackpots. If you go to New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, you're going to find people who just want to get along, though they recognize the empire. Virginia is also something of a different story because the Virginians are looking at the Ohio River Valley and they want to get their hands on it. But it's really Boston. So if the British wanted a base from which to win back independence, New York would actually be a much better base, better harbor. It doesn't freeze the way Boston Harbor does, for one thing. And you're not surrounded by people who think you're some kind of an enemy. However, you've brought this big army here. If you now leave Boston, that's going to make people in England think, well, wait a minute, do they know what they're doing? How can they give up that territory? So this is a big problem for the British because militarily, they know they have to leave Boston, but politically, that's an almost impossible thing to do. So this is what's happening with the British, at the same time as Washington is trying to figure out how to do something with this army. And Washington, of course, wanted to fight. When he was on his way, he had heard about the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he knew that a battle like that would really discourage the British public. They're going to think, well, we can't keep losing ground like this. As I said, after Bunker Hill, the British hold this territory, but they've lost almost 1,000 men. Nathaniel Greene said, I wish we could sell them another hill at the same price. Every man they have lost is someone they have to replace with someone brought over from Europe. So another battle like that, Washington thinks, is going to convince the British public that they can't win the war, and they will pressure the government to change policy. However, Washington's officers, the men who were there at Bunker Hill, recognize how difficult it would be to have another engagement like that, because the British aren't stupid. They learn things from these disasters. One thing they learned, as I said last time, on the 16th of June, they had scouted Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, and there was nothing there. Overnight, the Americans had built fortifications that were able to withstand 2 British assaults. And that's going to be the last time during the course of the war that the British will attack any position that the Americans have had time to fortify. General Howe said those men built overnight something that would have taken my men 3 months to do. So they're not going to attack another fortification like that. So the alternative is for the American militia, these relatively untrained troops, to get into a direct conflict with the British Army. And there, Washington's officers knew they would probably lose. They're not as well trained. And it was really an act of tremendous heroism on the part of those men in the first battlement to withstand these British assaults. You can't count on that again. So Washington keeps bringing up at his council of war, where he assembles all of the other officers, and he says we should attack. And they say, yeah, we don't think that's going to work. And you do see, in addition to seeing Washington's character and command, you also see in this period Washington learning how to work with these soldiers who come from a different world. He knows he has to lead by bringing them together, and he recognizes, okay, we can't have a direct attack, although he keeps pushing for one. And at the same time, this is as fall is now turning into winter in Boston, and Washington has another big problem, which is that all of these men who had come out in April are only supposed to serve until the end of the year. So, and in fact, the troops from Connecticut keep going home. Washington keeps writing to the governor of Connecticut about troops who are leaving. We need more troops to come. And Washington realizes he has to recruit a new army, basically to do this siege duty in and around Boston, at the same time as he's not letting the British in Boston know that this is happening. You can't simply put out want ads and say we need soldiers, because then the British will know they need soldiers. The British will know in late December, early January, that he doesn't have enough men in these fortifications. They look pretty good. And they also don't know that he doesn't have that many cannon in them. Remember, Henry Knox had been sent to Ticonderoga to bring back the cannon. He had left in early December, and he said he expected to be back in about 3 weeks. He actually delivers the cannon in February. So they don't have cannon, they don't have that many men, and they also don't have much gunpowder. So these are real problems for Washington. So he's recruiting a new army. He's learning how to command these men. And he is also having to fool the British into thinking he has a much bigger force than he does. It's really a masterful job that Washington is doing, even though we can look at pieces of it and marvel that the whole thing didn't fall apart. The British have their own problems. Remember, they're besieged in Boston. no firewood, no fresh provisions. They can't get them from the surrounding area. So they do knock down any abandoned buildings they find, including the old Church of Cotton Mather, and they tear the shingles and shutters off of buildings, cut down every tree in Boston, including the Liberty Tree, which actually one soldier dies in cutting down the Liberty Tree, which stood at the, roughly here is where the Liberty Tree stood, and as well as every other available tree in the town of Boston. And so they are struggling in Boston with a lack of food, supplies, firewood, etc. So this is the state of things over the winter of 1775, early 1776. Now, a couple of things I'll just mention briefly. One is in October of 1775, while Washington is confronting all of these problems, he gets an amazing letter from Phillis Wheatley, someone whose name he knew very well. Phillis Wheatley had published her first book of poems in 1773, published it in London. She had come to Boston as a young girl, about 7 or 9 years old, from West Africa. She had come as a slave. She was brought on a ship called the Phyllis, bought by the Wheatley family. And the Wheatleys saw this very small girl. No one had wanted to buy her when the ship stopped in Barbados. And so the Wheatleys buy her to be a companion to their daughter, who's about the same age. And so Phyllis and Susanna Wheatley both are given the same lessons, but Phyllis Wheatley far exceeds her white owner's daughter. She learns not only English, but Latin and Greek. And by the time she's a teenager, she is writing poetry in the style of the day. Her first published poem was in 1770. It was a tribute to George Whitefield, the great evangelist, English evangelist, who had traveled throughout the American colonies and actually died in Newburyport, where he is buried. So she wrote a poem about George Whitefield, which was published. And then she wrote other tributes to people. I think last time I mentioned the poem she wrote about Christopher Sider, who died also in 1770, killed by Ebenezer Richardson. And so she had gone to London with with the white family who owned her. And there she published her first book of poems. She was received at court in London. The Countess of Huntingdon, one of the great English philanthropists, had met her. So she is somebody on the world stage, a published poet, and poets at that time were really pretty important in the world, and received at court, something Washington certainly never had happened to him. She's an international celebrity. He's a leader of troops from Virginia. He gets a letter from her, including a poem she had written about Washington. And remember, this is at a time when Washington doesn't know how he's going to get out of this situation. And the poem ends with this quatrain: "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine with gold unfading, Washington, be thine." Imagine this. He hasn't done anything yet, and she's saying he's going to have a crown, a mansion, and a throne, and Washington in capital letters. A later American poet noted the difficulty in writing poems about Washington, and that the only word that rhymes with Washington is Washington. But Phillis Wheatley does this, sends this to George Washington, doesn't quite know what to do with it. And so he does something that's actually quite smart if you're in a position like Washington's. I mentioned his secretary, Joseph Reed, who at this time is going back to Pennsylvania. He sends it to Reed. Reed sends it to the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine, which is the only magazine in the American colonies. And this is published in the February issue because everyone knows who Phillis Wheatley is. And here's a poem about Washington. And this kind of embarrasses Washington because Phillis Wheatley now is going to read this magazine and see there's her poem that she sent to Washington, and he hasn't even bothered to write to thank her. So in late February, he does write to Phillis Wheatley, He had received the poem in December, actually, and he says, "I thank you most sincerely for your polite notice of me and the elegant lines you enclosed. However undeserving I may be of such encomium and panegyric, the style and manner exhibit a striking proof of your poetical talents, in honor of which, and as a tribute justly due to you, I would have published the poem had I not been apprehensive that while I had only meant to give the world this new instance of your genius, I might have incurred the imputation of vanity." Imagine that. He is publishing the poem and he fears that people think it's because he is so vain. He wants to have it published, not because he wants to give the world another example of the poetical talents of Phyllis Wheatley. "If you should ever come to Cambridge or near headquarters, I shall be happy to see a person so favored by the muses, and to whom nature has been so liberal and beneficent in her dispensations. I am, with great respect, your obedient, humble servant, George Washington." Imagine this. Washington still owns slaves. He's writing to Phyllis Wheatley, offering to show her around the camp, and also calling himself, and this was simply the style of the time, her obedient, humble servant. And one thing we do know of from Washington in this period, during the course of the Revolution, he is rethinking the institution of slavery, because he is seeing not only the poetical talents of Phyllis Wheatley, but also Black men who are fighting in his army. He still owns slaves and will to the end of his life. He will set his enslaved people free on his death, actually, and on the death of his wife. Well, he's worried about, well, it's a long, complicated story, but we see the institution of slavery really being challenged by the force of the revolution. It's unlikely that Washington and Phyllis Wheatley ever met. Um, she's living in Rhode Island. The family had left Boston to go to the security of Rhode Island. And during the time when she might have, Washington is quite busy planning the evacuation of Boston, which is going to happen in March of 1776. We don't know that it's going to happen then. So strike that from the record. As I said, Henry Knox arrives in Framingham actually in February with the 80 pieces of artillery that he has brought across the Berkshires. And they are delivered to Washington, who has some of them placed over here at Lechmere Point in Cambridge. Because what Washington, by the way, the whole Back Bay froze during the winter. And Washington kept asking the officers if they thought it was frozen solid enough so that he could send men across it to attack Boston. And they kept saying, no, it's not frozen solid enough. But that's what he wants to do. So he has some cannon placed here, and he will use those when they have sufficient gunpowder to fire at Boston for two reasons. One is he wants the British to think this is where he is going to attack from. The second reason is cannon make a lot of noise, and the noise of the cannon being fired here are also going to cover up the sound from Roxbury and Dorchester of trees being cut down, so that men there can build what are called chandeliers and other pieces of equipment that they're going to haul up here to Dorchester Heights in what's now South Boston, to bring artillery there, to bring the British fleet in the harbor, as well as the town of Boston and Castle Island, which is a British fortification, within their range. This is the highest point south of Boston, just as Bunker Hill is the highest point north of the town. And in fact, after Bunker Hill, General Clinton had advised the other generals that maybe they should really fortify Dorchester Heights. And the others said, by the way, General Clinton wrote a memoir of the war, which is well worth reading. He gets kind of a bad rap generally. I think it's because of his personality. But, and one persistent theme in his autobiography is, if they had listened to General Clinton, things would have turned out much differently. And this is a case where he's probably right. He said we should fortify Dorchester Heights. And the other general said, no point to. The rebels don't have any artillery. And even if they could get the heights, they couldn't possibly hold them. So Dorchester Heights remained unfortified until the first week of March of 1776. And on the night of March 3rd and 4th, while American artillery is bombarding from Lechmere Point, General John Thomas, who is in the command here in Roxbury, has about 700 men bring the cannon through Dorchester up to the heights. Actually, oxen pull them, and the oxen, leased from farmers in the area, get to the bottom of the hill, and the farmer said, no, you're not going to use my ox to bring those cannon up the hill. So the men have to drag the cannon up the hill, along with these chandeliers and the barricades they've made out of the wood they've cut. Remember, back in June at Bunker Hill, overnight, these men had dug trenches. It's now March. The ground is frozen pretty solid. So they know they have to build any fortifications they're going to use at Dorchester Heights and then haul them up to the heights, because this peninsula of South Boston doesn't have any trees on it. So that's what happens on the night of March 3rd and 4th. And General Howe, watching in Boston, wakes up and sees that suddenly there are these cannon looking down on their fleet. Now, a similar problem to what happened with the Diana at Noddle's Island. The British fleet does have more guns, but you can't really elevate the guns enough to hit these targets up here. So the Americans have a great tactical advantage here in placing the guns on high ground. Something good to remember: place your guns on high ground if you want to have command of a situation. And so what will the British do? And the first thing they want to do is actually the 5th of March. The British are going to attack. They plan an assault. The troops are going to leave here and go across to Dorchester Neck, land in Dorchester Neck, climb up the hill, and take the guns. Washington and the others knew that this is what they were going to do. So one thing they had done, in part of the fortifications they had brought, were rope nets that were filled with rocks. And they called these barrels. They look like barrels, but they actually are rope that hold all of these rocks. And they're part of the fortification. And the advantage is, if you're at the top of the hill and you need to, you can push them and they'll roll down the hill and they'll roll over anyone who's trying to get up the hill. And in one of his letters to General Thomas about the fortifications at Dorchester Neck, Washington had written his instructions, and then he realized after he sealed the letter he had forgotten something. So he wrote on the outside, "Don't forget the barrels," which Thomas didn't. And then the legend is that on the morning of March the 5th, after these men had spent a night and more building these fortifications, Washington came to the heights. And he said, it was the 5th of March, he said. And he told these men, this is a day never to be forgotten. An engagement was fully expected. The 5th of March. All Bostonians knew what the 5th of March was. And Washington knew what the 5th of March was. It was the anniversary of the massacre. And this would be their real test, if these men of Boston would allow them to triumph on the 5th of March. Washington said an engagement was fully expected, and I never saw spirits higher or more prevailing. Now, Washington has two things in mind. One, the British are going to come this way, and his idea is, once their army leaves Boston, why not have ours cross over from Cambridge and attack? His generals think that's really not a good idea. And it's probably fortunate for both sides what happens next, an act of nature. The British troops do get across to Dorchester Neck, and then a big northeast storm blows up, and they can't land. And they are sent to Castle Island. And General Howe realizes, they really now, of course, the rebels know they're going to be coming. So you can't launch a surprise attack now once you've already had a surprise attack that didn't work. So Washington also doesn't get to attack the British in Boston. So a day or two later, actually on the 8th of March, someone from Boston's Board of Selectmen, who was still in town, comes to the sentry point here. The British let him come out, and he hands to a sentry on the American side a letter to deliver to General Washington. I should say that over the course of the siege, the British had periodically written to Washington directly to arrange prisoner exchanges and other things. And they always were addressed to me either as Mr. Washington or Colonel Washington, not General Washington. They weren't going to acknowledge his position as a general. They would call him Colonel because he had been a colonel of the Virginia Regiment under the British Crown. Washington would not respond to these letters if they would not call him general. And we might think, boy, how full of himself he is. But his point was, his commission came from the choice of a free people. And it wasn't that the British were disrespecting him. The British were disrespecting the people who had chosen him. Thus, he wouldn't respond. Now, in this case, the head of the Board of Selectmen brings a letter addressed to General Washington, and in it he says he heard General Howe say that if Washington doesn't attack the British while they are leaving Boston, he won't set fire to the town on their way out. This tells Washington two things. The most important being that the British are going to leave. The other is they're not going to tell him this. It's an unofficial message. Washington says he's not going to respond to it, but it does give him an indication. And he and his men spend the next days watching from their points, from Prospect Hill, from Dorchester Heights. In fact, they do build another fortification here at Nook Hill, which puts their artillery even closer to Boston. And they watch as the British Army is making preparations to leave. Now, in addition to the army, the British also have to take with them about 1,100 people, Bostonians, people from Massachusetts, who want to remain loyal to the British Crown. And they don't want to stay in Boston once the rebels get their hands on it. So Howe is actually overseeing quite a big operation here. And he's also trying somewhat to control looting, but that's very difficult. Some warehouses are broken open, and soldiers and others are taking everything they can. And some of the houses that have been occupied are stripped. Others, John Hancock's house, they keep a pretty good record of what was there. It was occupied actually by General Clinton, who keeps a very good record of what was there and makes sure that nothing that belonged to Hancock was taken. So the British are evacuating Boston, and Washington, in addition to keeping an eye on them, is beginning to send his forces to two other places. One is to New York, knowing that's where the British are going to go, and the other is to Canada. I think next time I'll talk more about the Canadian expedition, which began with high hopes and ends with less high hopes as all of this is happening. So you do have the British, though, making preparations to leave. And on the 17th of March, General Sullivan from Plowed Hill sees them getting into their boats at Long Wharf and dropping out down the harbor toward Castle Island, sees the garrisons emptying, and they see others boarding their ships. And the 17th of March is the day the British get onto their boats and leave Boston, although they don't go very far. They have to wait for the tide. So the British fleet is hanging out just outside of the harbor. Now, on the 17th, Washington gives orders: no soldiers who have not had smallpox can go into Boston. And also, the first general to go into Boston won't be Washington. It will be Artemas Ward.
Ward had been the commander of the Massachusetts troops when Washington arrived. He's the guy Washington supplanted. And there were kind of bad feelings between Washington and Ward. And so you wonder, well, why then does Washington send Ward into Boston? The reason you had to have smallpox to go in was because there was a smallpox outbreak going on in Boston. Washington did not want anyone to get it. Washington had smallpox. He could have gone into Boston with no problem. But the reason he's sending Ward in is Ward was the general appointed by the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts. He is the highest ranking military official under the command of Massachusetts. So Ward's entry into Boston is not the arrival of a conquering army. It is the restoration of the civil government of Massachusetts in the person of Artemas Ward, designated by the Provincial Congress. And as Ward is preparing to come in by way of Boston Neck, some of the soldiers from Plowed Hill are going into Charlestown, and they see at the foot of Breed's Hill a British sentry position, and there still is a British soldier there. They are very careful about approaching this sentry point, and when they get there, they discover it's not a soldier, it's a dummy in a British uniform. And the dummy is holding a sign saying, "Welcome, Brother Jonathan." Jonathan was a nickname that the British and others had for the New Englanders. So, and Brother Jonathan was thought to be kind of simple. But in this case, Brother Jonathan is actually the victor here. Washington ordered General Sullivan to occupy Charlestown, and he sent another 500 men into Boston. Colonel Larned and opens the gate, and they actually have to scatter the iron crow's feet that the British have placed along what's now Washington Street. Rufus Putnam and his men cross from Lechmere Point, and they arrive in Boston at noon. And then while Washington is attending a church service in Cambridge, the American forces are occupying the town of Boston. And the text for the minister's sermon in Cambridge that day was taken from the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 14, verse 25. And took off their chariot wheels, that they drove them heavily, so that the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians." This is a signal moment in American history, the departure of the British from Boston. This is the first American victory in what will be a war for independence. And the British are still hovering outside of Boston, but they are on their way out. And Washington, as I said, has sent his fleet, his men, many of his men, to New York, which will be the next battlefield in the war. March 17th, 1776, and this is why it is still Evacuation Day in the city of Boston. So that's it for tonight. I will see you all on Wednesday.